Okay, let's get into this. The source material we're looking at today is, frankly, it's gut-wrenching, but it's also absolutely essential if you want to understand a human rights crisis that, often gets overlooked.
It really is. We're talking about a report called 116 Minority Killings in 7 Months, Bangladesh's Crisis of Impunity.
And our deep dive today is based on that document compiled by the Human Rights Congress for Bangladesh Minorities, or HRCBM.
Exactly. They looked at a very specific time frame, just 7 months, from June 6th, 2025 to January 5th, 2026.
So our mission here is to go beyond that pop-line number, right? To synthesize the patterns and understand why the report frames this as a crisis of impunity.
That's the key, the impunity part. It's not just about the violence, but why it's allowed to happen.
And that raw number, 116 verified killings
Yeah.
in 7 months. It's immediately staggering.
It is. And it's not localized, which is a really critical finding.
Right. HRCBM verified incidents across all 8 administrative divisions and in at least 45 different districts.
Yeah, and when you see a death toll spread out that widely, you know this isn't just random crime.
It's a national pattern. It has to be.
It is, and that's where the history comes in. When you see something like this, geographically spread out but demographically concentrated, the first question you have to ask is this new?
Or is it part of something older?
Exactly. And the report argues very strongly that this is not some episodic spike. It's structural. It's been reoccurring for generations.
They lay out this historical timeline that is.
Yeah.
It's just jarring. This continuity of violence going back almost 80 years.
I mean, major episodes in 1946, 1950, 1964, 1971, and then it just keeps going right up through 2024, 2025. It's a painful, painful history.
To really get the gravity of that, you have to look at the demographic numbers the report presents.
Yes. This provides the context for what they call structural persecution. So we're talking about the minority population Hindus, other non-Muslims, in the territory of what is now Bangladesh. Back in 1946, they were about, 28 to 30% of the population.
And the change since then is, well, it's remarkable, isn't it?
It is. The total population of the country more than quadrupled, just from overall growth. But the minority share of that population just collapsed.
Collapsed to what?
Less than 9% by 2020. And the report is very clear that this can't be explained by natural trends, not by a long shot.
So if it's not just people leaving voluntarily or, different birth rates, what's the mechanism the report points to?
They argue it reflects, and I'm quoting here, sustained patterns of targeted persecution and structural exclusion.
Which means things like land grabbing, forced conversions.
All of it. And of course, violence that leads to displacement.
Right.
So in that context, these 116 killings documented in 2025, they aren't outliers.
They're the lethal endpoint, as the report puts it, the sharpest end of this long generational process.
Precisely.
That perspective is so important. It makes you see the data not as crime statistics, but as evidence of a systemic breakdown.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's zoom in on this 7-month snapshot. What did the violence look like month to month?
Well, the monthly progression is crucial. It shows this wasn't stabilizing. It was actually getting worse.
It was intensifying.
Yes. It starts in June 2025, but then you see this decisive surge in September with 21 incidents. Then it peaks sharply, 23 incidents in October, and it hits that same peak again in December. The threat was consistently high.
And what about geographically? You said it was a widespread, but were there specific hotspots, entrenched risk zones?
Yeah, absolutely. While 45 districts were affected, a handful really account for a disproportionate number of deaths.
Okay.
Chittagong Division had the highest count, 35 deaths, then Dhaka Division with 25. Those seem to be the regions where the structural risk is most deeply entrenched.
Let's shift to the victims themselves. Who are the people behind these 116 incidents? What's the demographic profile look like?
The majority are working-age men. This reflects their exposure, as primary income earners and as frequent targets in these kinds of communal conflicts.
But not exclusively men.
Oh, no. The violence was indiscriminate enough to include women, girls, at least one boy. But the real focus was on the community's core, the economic and social backbone.
People aged, 18 to 45?
Exactly. Youth and working-age adults.
And this is where it gets really important, I think. The detail that goes beyond the number and shows the real impact. The report talks about the economic devastation.
Yes, this is the structural multiplier effect. It's so key. The report notes that the person killed was often the sole income earner.
So a murder isn't just taking a life.
No, it's an economic weapon. It's a social weapon. It instantly plunges the surviving family, the widow, the elderly parents, the children, into just immediate destitution.
So the killing itself serves to eliminate an individual,
Yeah.
but also to economically break and displace the entire family unit.
Precisely. You eliminate their means of survival, you force them to move.
Hmm.
And that feeds directly back into that long-term demographic collapse we talked about.
It's persecution through economic coercion, triggered by murder.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, that's a powerful lens. So moving on, HRCBM was able to classify these killings into 5 recurring patterns, which again suggests this is structured violence. This is not chaos.
Right. Not spontaneous. So let's walk through the main types, starting with the largest category, targeted murders.
Which accounts for almost half the cases, right?
Just about 48.3%. And these are characterized by, clear premeditation. The victim is selected specifically because they're part of a minority community, and you often see efforts to conceal the crime.
Can you give us an example, a case that really illustrates that premeditation?
Sure. Take the case of Rupanath, a 37-year-old Hindu youth. His body was found on a riverbank in Chattogram, but it's how it was found that's so telling.
Okay.
His head was buried under sand and covered with leaves. There was a rope found nearby. I mean, that is not a crime of passion. That is a planned execution followed by an attempt to hide the evidence.
And how do they know the motive wasn't just, say, robbery? How can they be sure it was targeted?
Well, look at the case of Subrata Chandra Das, a Hindu civilian ambushed in broad daylight, murdered by having his throat slit.
Horrific.
It is. But the key detail here, investigators noted his motorcycle was left untouched, a valuable item that helps eliminate robbery as a motive. It confirms that he, Subrata, was the target.
Because of who he was.
Because of who he was. And they also note the targeting of community leaders, like a man named Bijan Kumar Des in Satpura. When you target leaders, you're trying to decapitate the community's ability to even organize or resist.
Okay, the second major type you mentioned, mob lynchings and rumor-driven killings. This seems almost more terrifying because of the public nature of it.
It is. This type of violence relies on rumor. The rapid spread of a false story, often about theft or blasphemy, to turn a private grievance into a public execution.
So the rumor is like a trigger. It dehumanizes the victim instantly.
That's its function, exactly. Take the case of Ruplal Das and Pradeep Das in Rangpur. 2 Hindu men just returning home at night, falsely accused of theft, and a mob beat them to death.
Just based on an accusation.
Just based on that. And the blasphemy cases, they often have the highest level of malice, like the case of Dipu Chandra Das.
Right, in Mymensingh.
Yes. He was lynched and then burned after a blasphemy allegation. And the report notes that people in the crowd were actively recording it on their phones.
That's a whole other level.
It's hugely significant. The public recording of that kind of brutality, it's not just documenting a crime. It's an act of terror against the entire community. It reinforces this idea that this violence is normal, that it's acceptable, because the state clearly isn't there to protect you.
It's hard to even process that level of malice, especially when you bring in the state itself. Which brings us to the third typology. Army and state security lethal force.
And this is such a grave category because the state is supposed to be the protector. It has this non-derogable obligation to protect life, not take it.
So what did HRCBM find?
They documented several incidents where uniformed security forces allegedly used lethal force against civilians, often during political unrest.
Are there specific examples of this conduct?
Yeah. In Gopalganj, a 25-year-old named Dipta Saha was shot dead during some political unrest. But HRCBM reviewed visual material showing what happened after he was shot.
Okay.
It shows uniformed personnel restraining his body with a boot placed on his neck and throat area. Now, regardless of the cause of death, that image, it raises what the report calls grave concerns about professional conduct.
That detail about the boot on the neck after he's already down, it speaks volumes about the perceived lack of accountability, doesn't it?
It really does. And then you have the coordinated attacks in Kagratari against indigenous communities. Arson, displacement, at least 5 confirmed deaths, and community members allege that army units used live fire on them.
Coordinated attacks, you said?
Over several days. That points to, at minimum, a catastrophic failure of command and control, or, at worst, institutional complicity.
And finally, the fourth type, Custodial and suspicious deaths, which points the finger directly at the justice system itself.
Absolutely. This is about accountability gaps. It includes deaths like Durjoy Chowdhury in Cox's Bazar, found dead in a hanging position inside a police lockup, a situation that just screams for an independent forensic review.
In HRCBM puts this in a wider context.
Right. They cite data from another human rights group, ASK, who reported at least 107 deaths in custody in Bangladesh in 2025, and that's across all demographics.
So it's a broader systemic risk.
It is, but for minorities who are already being targeted outside, they become exponentially more vulnerable once they're inside state custody.
Okay, so we've covered the history, the scale, the clear patterns of the violence, which brings us to the core argument of the report, the crisis of impunity. How do they define this failure that allows this to keep happening?
Their core finding is that the violence is sustained, that it's repeatable because of these persistent and systemic failures in the criminal justice system's response.
So the state is failing its most basic duties.
Essentially, yes. It's failing to fulfill its due diligence obligations, both under its own domestic laws, like the Code of Criminal Procedure, and under international human rights law.
Let's break that down. What's the first line of defense that keeps collapsing?
It's the refusal to even start the legal process. The very first step for a serious crime like murder is filing a first information report, an FIR. Families consistently told HRCBM that police were either reluctant or just flat out refused to register one.
And if there's no FIR, then legally the crime basically disappears.
It vanishes, it kills accountability right at the start, and even when an FIR was filed, the second failure kicks in. Stalled investigations. Meaning the case just sits there, inactive for months, years, with minimal or no arrests, even when witnesses named the perpetrators.
It sounds like the system is almost designed to protect the accused, not the victim's family.
That is the clear implication of the data. And then there's the third pattern, active intimidation of the families and witnesses, pressuring them to drop the case.
Which would force them into some kind of a compromise settlement.
Exactly. Which legally just extinguishes any chance of accountability for murder. It turns the institutions that are supposed to protect people into a shield for the perpetrators.
So the report is alleging this is a breach of the state's international obligations to protect life, under things like the ICCPR.
Correct. And HRCBM warns that the systematic nature of these failures, this combination of identity-based targeting and the total collapse of the justice system, it meets recognized international atrocity risk thresholds.
In other words, when a state stops investigating murder against a specific group, it's creating an environment where more atrocities are not just possible, but predictable.
Highly predictable.
This brings us full circle then. We've got the historical continuity, the demographic collapse, the specific typologies, targeted, mob, state-linked, and the impunity that enables it all.
And that's why the report's recommendations are all about systemic change, not just arresting one or two people. They're calling for things like independent national inquiry commissions, special investigation units, and real diplomatic pressure for reform.
The goal being to disrupt that cycle. The report is clear. The institutional breakdown, that failure to investigate and prosecute, is the engine driving this violence.
It is the primary structural driver.
So if impunity is the key, this raises a crucial and, I think, provocative question for you, the listener, to think about. What foundational shift has to happen inside a nation's justice and security institutions before this kind of systemic threat of targeted killings can ever actually be dismantled? Is procedural justice in itself the ultimate, the non-negotiable protective mechanism?